Welcome to the Project Zion podcast. This podcast explores the unique spiritual and theological gifts Community of Christ offers for today's world.
Welcome. This is Cup of Joe, where we explore restoration history, and I'm your host, Karin Peter. Our guest today is John Hamer. The editors can decide if they want to take out, I was going to say, the infamous John Hamer. John is a map maker, an author, an historian, and a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. He's also a favorite presenter at the Sunstone Symposium, held annually in Salt Lake City, or in the COVID year of 2020 online, which was a great success. John currently serves as pastor of Toronto Center Place Congregation, and you can find him weekly online in the Beyond the Walls worship services and all of the different ministries that take place at Center Place throughout the week. So welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me on. Great to see you.
Well, it's good to see you as well. So your contribution to the Historic Sites Foundation Autumn Lecture Series was Bishop R.C. Evans of Canada, from the RLDS First Presidency to Schismatic Church Leader. Now, John, everybody who did lectures in this autumn series have these bulky titles. If you were running an ad campaign, what would you have called this?
Oh man, that's a good question. So yeah, that's a terrible title, the one you just read of mine, and it's tough because when you on the one hand you're doing something that's academic, and so that's kind of the academic title, right, as opposed to the more sensational or this kind of title. The problem with it is that we have. You want to try to throw in a bunch of stuff to make it so you can get to the interest groups, right? And so one of the things is when you're doing your hashtag for what the interest group you're trying to tag here is, we want to get to people to know this is our RLDS history. So this is Community of Christ history. People who maybe like the schismatic stuff, so when the church breaks apart, when people have these kind of conflicts and somebody decides, I'm having my own church, then that kind of thing is a branch of history that people, I think, find fascinating. And so, yeah, I don't know. I guess what you'd probably do is what you'd want to do if you're going to have a great title. Yeah. So like his contemporary that he worked under, Joseph III, the biography from Lillenas is called Pragmatic Prophet, right? Mm-hmm. And so he was able that's a beautiful title, where he was able to kind of sum up, with just one adjective, kind of how you understand or how we can get a mental picture of how Joseph III's ministry was, which on the one hand, he's certainly, I think he's very visionary and wants to accomplish and did accomplish a lot of amazing stuff. But as opposed to, let's say, his own father, who was anything but pragmatic, he was much more practical and in some ways, I'd say, a lot more successful at accomplishing stuff that was long lasting or was lasting, as opposed to something that was always the putting on the burner and it was always boiling over. His father created the boil. But whether or not that was, obviously lots of things have survived, but it wasn't necessarily if he hadn't gotten killed, and who knows what could happen. Yeah. So I don't have one for R.C. Evans because he's not as well known. And so here's a figure that was very well known in his day, but it's obscure now, and it's also dipping into this period of church history that is ignored. And so we're very aware of that early church period. And so we are just continuously wafting our minds back to 1830. And we're just always thinking about those kind of context of that 14-year period of time of the early church organization, or a little bit in a couple years beforehand. But then maybe we're a little bit aware of the reorganization period and what, kind of just that leading up in that conference. I don't think we spend as much time on Joseph III at all as we should. But anyway, people have started to be a little more aware of the Joseph III history. But even in American history generally, once you get past the Civil War and you get into this kind of murky period of the Gilded Age and the robber barons and the railroads and all that kind of stuff, that's all, nobody knows anything from the Civil War to, I don't know, World War I. It's all merges in there, right? And so
Yeah.
But there were important presidents, McKinley or somebody, you know what I mean? These kind of people that are nobody thinks about anymore. And so the same way, there's this very interesting time period when the reorganization is really, really picking up steam. When Joseph III goes to that conference in Amboy and is recognized as the prophet and president of the church, there's maybe 300 members of the new organization at that point. Within just a few years or whatever, there's tens of thousands. And so things go quite rapidly. And this is a really interesting time period for when the church was expanding.
Well, thanks for that. That helps put it in this different kind of a context for us so we can understand kind of where we're going. So if you go to view the lecture, and we encourage everyone to do that, and we'll give you some information at the end of our podcast, you have some great photos. And so I'm very visual. And when I looked at the photos of R.C. Evans, you had mentioned right off the bat that he was known as a gifted orator and one with an ego, one with quite an ego. And I must admit that when I saw the photos of him as a young person, he had a certain cockiness to him. And he had this smile that was a smirk. And then you go on to his photos as an older person, he kept that smirk his whole life.
Yeah.
So a foreshadow of things to come, I noticed as I then watched the lecture. So let's get into that. You begin by giving us some context about R.C. Evans. So set the stage for us about some of the history of the church in Toronto that's so important for us to understand R.C. Evans and his importance.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that led me to this story, so I'm the pastor of this congregation that R.C. Evans was associated with. He wasn't ever the pastor because he was too important to be the pastor of any congregation. So he was more important. So right from the start, he was going to be the district president or president of the Canadian mission or whatever. But this was his home fief, but as a congregation. But actually, good for the congregation's own independent development, it always had its own regular congregational apparatus and a pastor and everything like that were separate from R.C. Evans and his enormous ego. So in other words, even though he was there and among and massively affecting the congregation did have its own identity, and that became important when the split later happened. Like you're saying, one of the things that led me to it initially is visuals. I'm very visual as well. And we have in the congregation, we've preserved all of these archives and historic photos and files and documents and everything like that going back to the 19th century. And one of the photos we have is a very large form print of R.C. Evans speaking in one of the biggest contemporary theaters of the early 20th century, and it's just filled with 7,000 people as he's preaching. And this is a pretty remarkable thing. There's not a lot of Community of Christ preachers right now who are addressing crowds of 7,000 for a sermon very often, or however many thousand. I don't know how many people are in this theater really, but anyway, there's a lot of people in this full 3 triple-decker theater. And so I'm like, wow, this is an interesting component of our past, in the congregation. And so, to set the tone, when the Canada, is the very first country that the original church members they're from upstate New York. They cross the border and they start converting people in Canada fairly early. So Canada's after the U.S. is the first country that the things get introduced to the church. And in Toronto was one of the first places where there was a congregation. The original pastor of the original congregation in Toronto is John Taylor, who later ended up being one of the apostles. He later sided with Brigham Young and went off to Utah and became Brigham Young's successor as the leader of the LDS Church. And so Toronto has kind of an interesting history of interesting guys, some of these folks that have been leading. The church fell into disorganization everywhere. There were old-time saints that continued to be here, but the congregation wasn't actively meeting. And so one of the things that happened with the reorganization period from 1860 onward to the 1890s or something is that old members were continually found and gathered in. New people were excited about it, their kids, their grandkids also, and they would start making new cottage meetings. And from the cottage meetings, they'd try to eventually have enough that they could get their own little building and so on and get going like that. And so R.C. Evans had been converted by the very first really important missionary, or the main, not first, but the main important missionary in Canada, J.J. Cornish, who just founded congregation after congregation. He's the reason there's so many congregations across Canada and also across Michigan. He converted R.C. Evans, and then R.C. Evans went on to help found the Toronto congregation. And this is all happening in the later 19th century, right up to leading up to the 20th century.
How old was R.C. Evans when he joined the RLDS Church?
So
he was a young man.
He's very young. So yeah, his dad joined. His dad joined when he's 14, and so then he himself joins 2 years later when he gets to go meet Cornish for himself.
Okay, excellent. And you have some photos of that time period that are really great in the lecture as well. So again, pointing our listeners to go and to view that. So he's in Toronto. He's a young man. He starts to grow up. What happens with him? How does he become a church leader, and what was he like?
So yeah, he has a fairly rapid rise. He's good at studying. He becomes a strong speaker. And so as people kind of notice, not only in Toronto, he was in London, which is where the kind of the base of the church is where J.J. Cornish was. And so he'd been there, and he went kind of rapidly through the priesthood ranks until, as I say, fairly early on, he makes it to be even like a district president. And so then he becomes known because one of the things appointees or people who are church leaders who are working kind of for the general church, what was then called the general church, as the world church, one of their main jobs was to go around and actually preach for people. And so now there's all kinds of other things that staff should be doing, but in the old days, the expectation that everybody had was that the staff are the great preachers. And what they do is they go around as itinerary people, and they go to each branch by branch. And then you advertise essentially that we're going to have this great preacher, you're going to have a revival, and you get people to come out there. And then people who like it stay in that little branch. And so it got to be the point very quickly that because he was such a good preacher, and because everybody responded so well, that he would have his whole preaching itinerary planned for a whole year. As he was preaching reunions and congregations and things like that, he got the notice of the world headquarters, right? The general church headquarters. And so he started to, for example, preach at general conferences, world conferences. And that brought his attention to the Joseph III. Okay.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of his trajectory in leadership, because he caught the attention of Joseph III. So Where does that take him?
So once that happens, so he's age 36, this is 1897, and he's called into the 12. And so, in other words, he's recognized, so that's a very rapid rise, and makes it all the way up into, the primary missionary council of the church, as he's being recognized essentially for his preaching abilities, and the fact that those preaching abilities actually encourage people to join. That's how people are primarily brought into the church at this time of kind of rapid growth for the church.
Okay. So he's serving in the 12 at age 36.
Yes.
And still traveling through Canada on his itinerant preacher rounds. And his fame begins to grow more rapidly at that time, as well as the way in which he leads. So Joseph Smith III begins to really depend on him in some new ways. Can you kind of talk about how that relationship develops, how he kind of becomes a right-hand man, if you will, to Joseph Smith III?
So by the time the century turns, so at the beginning of the 20th century, then 1902, Joseph III now is 69 at that point. So he himself has been in charge of the church since very young, being a very young man. And in fact, actually, one of the things that's happened has been that as older members of the First Presidency or older other leaders have died off, he hasn't always refilled the positions. And so in some ways, the church is sort of vernacularly run. So still all the way up through this time period, I would say it's not a very professional organization, and it's rather a very volunteersy / whatever we're all, kind of deciding to do when we get together and do it. There's not a substantial bureaucracy or anything like that behind it until Joseph III's son, Fred M., revolutionizes kind of how the church headquarters system works. That doesn't happen yet. But at this point, as a 69-year-old, Joseph III is starting to think, okay, I got to think about what comes after me. And he starts working on both ideas for succession, but also like writing out, ultimately formulating letters to the church about how do you understand succession and what is the constitution of the church about this kind of a thing. And so he called for the first time now into the First Presidency R.C. Evans, who'd been one of these apostles, and he also calls his son F.M. Smith into the First Presidency. But F.M. is a bunch younger than Evans. Evans now is 40. F.M. Smith is 28. F.M. Smith is in graduate school. He's getting a PhD, which is really amazing at this time period, that Joseph Jr.'s grandson actually gets a PhD in sociology. It's remarkable that was able to happen. But in any event, Evans considers himself to be, very much the first counselor in the First Presidency and not the second counselor. In other words, he's the one that has the actual experience. And one of the things that happens is, for example, they go together, Joseph III and R.C. Evans go together on a tour of the United Kingdom and visit all the saints in all the congregations in Britain and so on. And because Joseph III is older and is more winded, he'll get up and say a few remarks, and then he turns it over to R.C., who brings the house down. Right. And so that really gives R.C. Evans a sense of he's in the presidency. He's the guy, the next guy, as the old guy who he respects is kind of winding down. He's going to be the guy.
So he truly believes he will succeed Joseph III as president of the church.
So yeah, I think it seems pretty clear that he feels that that's the direction that tea leaves are going. I don't think that he certainly doesn't have a promise in hand or some kind of a revelation that says that's going to happen. But he's reading tea leaves. He's wanting that to happen for himself. A lot of times we think that the RLDS tradition was entirely always about lineal succession. In other words, it always had to go father, son to brother, to brother, to brother, to son, or whatever, brother or son. But in fact, actually, Joseph III made it very clear that he didn't believe that was the case. So whereas many early RLDS members did think that there was a lineal priesthood or lineal succession because they had heard that preached by Joseph Smith Jr.'s brother, William Smith. William Smith was a great promoter of the fact that brothers should take over after their brothers die. It's not a self-serving doctrine at all, but but it was definitely one that he promulgated and popularized. Joseph III made it very clear. No, the point here is that my father ordained me several times during his life to be his successor, and predicted several times that he would be the successor. In other words, that was part of his prophetic role. It was not about family. And so Joseph III indicated that he might have appointed anybody who God was calling to be the prophet of the church. He might appoint regardless of family. And the reality is, though, the practice continued to be familial until the 1990s. But there didn't have to go that way. And so R.C. Evans, I think, wasn't delusional to think that it could have gone to him.
So what happens when F.M. Smith is designated the successor?
Well, obviously, that's a big disappointment for R.C. Evans. So lots of things happen. So this is a big generational shift. It's sort of like what we're going to face in. You don't have to worry about it in the United States, but in the Commonwealth and in the UK and everything like that, when Queen Elizabeth passes away or decides finally that she's going to have to retire or whatever for health purposes, nobody hardly alive remembers any other monarch than her. I mean, you do if you're but it's a long time ago. Even so, right. No matter how old you are, that's been a long time. And she was queen when Churchill was prime minister. You know what I mean? So likewise for the church. So after this is the whole lifetime of Joseph III being in charge, and nobody having any other thought of how that could be. And so it's no surprise that that any change would necessarily have to be revolutionary. And so the amount of problems that FM Smith ended up having, this whole crisis that's called supreme directional control. In other words, who's in charge, really is what kind of that was about, is kind of because he had ideas that were new and that were different, and everybody else was just used to what had always been. And so the idea that he did of wanting to modernize the church, of wanting to professionalize staff and responsibilities and things like that, and do different things. I mean, visionary stuff, make the auditorium, make the hospital, make all of these things, that they wanted to do to be, part of the 20th century. Nevertheless, he had caused a lot of conflicts with lots of people. And I don't think he's to blame for the conflict that he had with R.C. Evans. So I think R.C. Evans wouldn't have liked anybody who took over, but he certainly also doesn't like F.M. Smith. And so there is a very serious resentment that happens. And I think in some ways it's R.C. Evans' ego about wanting to have been the successor. And in another way, it's also a belief that he had that he was more qualified and would have done a better job of leading the church as a result. And so maybe that the church is being taken in a bad direction, he was probably thinking, but again, he's not totally unbiased about that component, or rather he's quite biased. But essentially the original kind of deal that they kind of work out is they'll just let R.C. Evans go back and have Canada as his fief. And so more or less R.C. Evans kind of becomes in charge of the church in Canada. And does a good job of continuing to develop stuff, especially in his sub-fief of Toronto. So in other words, he's on the one hand, Count of Toronto and Duke of Canada, or whatever it is, So he's in Toronto. This is when he's having those theater gigs, and so he's growing the congregation from being just a very tiny congregation to being, at some point, almost, if not the largest one, it's certainly one of the largest congregations of the RLDS Church in the early 20th century.
And growing his ego. Can you talk a little bit about the stained glass windows?
Yes. And so, when the congregation moves to its second building, because it quickly outgrows its very first building, one of the things they do is commission a stained glass window that is a triptych, which is a kind of a traditional Christian form of three, right? And sometimes in a triptych, you will have things like the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, or similar kinds of things, right? The adoration of that. Anyways, you might have any similar kinds of themes. But R.C. Evans' triptych is, it has, on the one hand, it's Jesus, right? And Joseph Smith and R.C. Evans. And R.C. Evans is in the middle, so of that.
Which says a lot about how he saw his own value and worth. So he does not become the president of the church. He does become the leader, however you want to describe it, of the church in Canada, and becomes the bishop of Canada. As it's almost like a reconciliatory offering to give the title Bishop of Canada. So what happens with that? I mean, why can't he be happy with that? How does the story go?
So the problem with it is that he might have been able to be happy with that, and it might have not, but whether he was happy or not, it may not have lasted either way. But he wasn't happy with it. And so one of the things that had happened was from that perch, he nevertheless couldn't help but look at headquarters, so look across the border and say, what's going on down there in Independence and Lamoni is not what I would be doing. Obviously, things are not going the way it should be. And so he was definitely the kind of person who was sniping from the sidelines. And so as a person who was kind of doing this kind of, sniping, that wasn't it wasn't like a thing where, okay, you're fine as long as you stay in Canada and don't bug us or something like that, and we'll deal with the problem later kind of a situation. Instead, it's like an active fomenting of problems when FM Smith has enough problems that he's got enough people to fight with in general. And so as a result probably as a result of R.C. Evans having a bunch of critical things to say about the church presidency and specifically the president, he was not invited to speak at a general conference. And so normally, because he had been, understood generally, I think quite broadly, as the best orator in the reorganization, but I think that there's no doubt about that. So I mean, and you can, all the different things you want to say nuanced about R.C. Evans and his ego and all the other kinds of things, I think that people can agree that probably from all accounts he was an amazing orator. And so from being the person who may well have been the best orator, not only in the whole restoration. So I don't know that anybody in the LDS church could match with this guy. But anyway, so he to a place where, he routinely not only preached once, World Conference, General Conference lasts all week long. He routinely is asked to preach multiple times, even in the course of a conference. And now he's disinvited from that at all. And so not invited. And so snub. He sees that as a snub. And so he goes back and grouses and now any kind of, like, let's say, passive sniping or whatever becomes kind of active grousing. And so active grousing ends up leading FM Smith to essentially create a commission to come and see what's going on in Canada. So the World Church, the General Church, has let Canadian church go its own way and let R.C. Evans do whatever he wants up there. Now there's going to be a prophetic commission, to come and review what's going on, and when they go there to review, nobody likes what's happening. So on the one hand, R.C. Evans and the congregation don't like oversight, and then the president of the church doesn't like open insurrection, and so it comes down to kind of a duel of that, a test of authority. And R.C. Evans, after getting to say his fill and to argue at length against the president in a business meeting, shout match, is relieved from priesthood and walks out. And so he walks out of the congregation, and so there's maybe 1,200 members of the congregation on the rolls at that point, and it's estimated that 300 or 400 of them walked out with R.C. Evans. And the reality is that when you say you have that many on the rolls, and you have that many walk out, I mean, the congregation, I mean, I'm the heir to the congregation, right? So, and I have all of our apologetics about what we said about this. We tried to minimize how many people walked out here, but I would say, realistically, it's got to be half, in terms of the people who were really active and paying tithing and that kind of a thing. And so he split the congregation in two as a result of that.
Is a huge deal. So I was struck when I watched this, and again when you talking about this, they actually came up the commission and gave him this chance to vent to them of whatever his issues were, and it made me think of our policy of faithful disagreement, which there are ways to vent that are healthy and there are ways to vent that are not healthy. And so one of the things is to vent from the pulpit.
Yes.
As not helpful for staying in good relationship all around.
Yeah. So he had the opportunity to present his case, and instead he took it as the opportunity. It's like when you also say you're going to give somebody enough rope to hang themselves. Mm-hmm. They gave him plenty of rope, and he chose to hang himself in that sense. So institutionally, so a lot of times when people decide they want to do something, they do that based on because they're mad and that makes them feel good or something like that. And so they don't always think of what they want the outcome to be. And so even if R.C. Evans was totally justified in all of his complaints, and he had justice on his side, the way that he went about it, I think there's no way that the outcome is that somehow he's now in charge of the church or something. You know what I mean? In other words, so this is not a forum where this kind of a grievance fest and complaining about the church president from the pulpit to his face it's not cowardly because you're saying, or something like that. But on the other hand, I don't see how it results in anything other than what happened. And so the presidency really has no choice but to say, okay, you've declared you're in open insurrection, so we don't have any. What can we do? So that's.
And that's what happens.
Yeah.
So even in the reorganization, there are limits.
Yeah.
Which most of us chafe at different times in our life, but they are there. So he leaves.
Yes.
He is relieved from priesthood. Half the Church of Toronto goes with him.
Yes.
What does he do now?
So he organizes his own new church, and he has lots of connections. And so his new church ultimately ends up getting called Church of the Christian Brotherhood. And there is just a beautiful and much more substantial church building that had been a Presbyterian church, which is right now in the middle of the city's hospital district. So it doesn't exist anymore. But they went and bought that, and so essentially got their own thing going, and actually, because of the connections and contacts that he had, he was able to. It's actually just down the street from the Parliament. He was able to get the Parliament to charter it, and essentially he creates what I would say is in practice an RLDS church from the early 20th century that nevertheless has jettisoned a bunch of restoration distinctives. And so he decides to root the Smith family and Joseph Smith and Book of Mormon and those kind of things all out of the church. But I would say that probably in practice and in general, the kind of doctrines and everything else would have all been more or less identical to what they would have experienced in the Toronto congregation. But it has that distinction. And so in that sense, it may well be, it's a post-restoration tradition church because it rejected the restoration tradition component of it. And yet it would be very identifiable probably if you were to just walk back and forth between the two churches.
So, and he doesn't leave needling the RLDS church alone.
No. Yeah. So yeah, his plan, and he actually starts it. But yeah, he's a great media guy. And so, the fact of being able to fill these theaters is a substantial thing. The fact that they print these broadsides, he prints open letters and pamphlets and all these kind of things. And so he's really good at spreading all that. And he definitely embarked on I'm going to take, the church down kind of campaign. And by the way, actually a lot of the people in his own congregation, his new church, were like, okay, let's just close that chapter and move on. Although some of them were perfectly happy to go on the tirade with him, but a bunch of them were like, okay, let's stop this now and let's just, do something positive and move forward. But no, when he ended up at the time of his death, which is right after this. And so he dies of flu of a year after the great Spanish flu pandemic. And in 1919, as he is preparing to an entire series of anti-RLDS lectures. And so ultimately he's thwarted in his goal of taking the RLDS church down. And remarkably, the congregation that he created in his church, despite the fact that it was kind of formed around him, nevertheless survived for about a generation. And also remarkably, considering again that he took a lot of the lifeblood and everything out of it, the Toronto congregation also regrouped and did very well. And so both went their own ways, and ultimately several members of R.C. Evans Church, when it over time slowly, either individually or when it all closed down, many of the ones who stayed with the restoration came back to various RLDS congregations. So.
Okay. You mentioned that he was an excellent marketer. You have some great photos in your presentation on the Historic Sites Foundation website where the social media of the day are individuals wearing placards on their,
yes.
Those things you see in cartoons, placards on the front and back, and then walking up and down the sidewalks, handing out papers.
We're seeing like Wimpy doing that in the old Popeye cartoons or something like that. So it's clear that that's what people were doing. In other words, they didn't just make it up for the cartoon. So yeah, they've got these things which they've printed. So they printed broadsides, and so they're huge and with giant fonts. Bishop Evans to preach on such and such, and so then the members, are just plastered in those things and walking up and down, got to the Princess Theater, 7 p.m., this kind of a thing. So it's a very amazing way, but that's the time period of how you did that kind of advertising. So it's really cool.
Oh, yeah, it's great. We need photos of that sent to communications at headquarters so they can appreciate how far we've come.
He has a really neat essay, or one of the times where he's explaining about the theater outreach. And he was saying, I got a lot of pushback from church members about this theater outreach because they're like, theaters are places of sin. And there was and all this kind of thing. Why are you in a theater and all this kind of thing? And I said, I'm in a theater to access all of these people who wouldn't step into a church. And so it's kind of an interesting argument because that is something that we've continued in Toronto, where we have been continually innovative outreach, right? And so where we are doing things where our invitational ministry is in places and locations and including our new facility, which doesn't look particularly church-like. And people ask, well, why are you doing that? And we have a similar answer to what R.C. Evans was saying all the way back then.
Yeah, one of the contributions that you can trace back in the Toronto congregation to his understanding of what it meant to reach out to people where they are. Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the other important contributions that you could kind of say R.C. Evans gave to the church?
Well, to the congregation, besides that one, which I think is good, is that he also, I think, contributed to a congregational tradition of being ornery.
Yeah.
So the congregation has been very proud of like congregational autonomy and saying like congregations have their own say so on things, and so I like have all of the records and things like that, and so there will be like a note that the World Church President W. Wallace Smith came and they appointed so and so to be the pastor, and the congregational historian writes at that point, which is out of order because the World Church has no authority to appoint pastors. And also,
there you go. Yeah.
And there was a tradition too that the congregation was the last congregation in Canada to surrender its deed to the World Church, and and all this stuff, and even down to when I first became associated with the congregation, one of the things that I found was central to congregational identity. So the church headquarters in Canada is in the town of Guelph. And so Guelph is shorthand. It's like you might say independence for everybody else, Mm-hmm. So when you're talking about church headquarters around here, people say Guelph. And so the congregation recorder and things like that, to get on our good side, whenever you would, at a certain point, you learn to say, "Oh, Guelph." Even though, by the way, I've always found Guelph to be so easy to work with. Everybody there wants to help the congregations, everything like that. But that was not the congregational preserved memory, right? The memory was that we were doing all these things in Guelph anyway. So
I think many congregations listening to this particular episode have had similar experiences, whether it's Guelph or whether it's Independence, where that has happened. And I spent some time in an honorary congregation myself. So
for the rest of the church, what I'd say is that definitely in terms of the succession, this was highlighting a lot of people were, let's say, thinking that lineal succession was the only way to go. And people were very much questioning that even in the 1990s when Grant McMurray, the first non-Smith, became president of the church. But I think it's a very clear illustration going all the way back to the succession from Joseph III on, that it was very viable all the way then to have whoever was being called, it was being called regardless of being a Smith or no. So that was certainly there. And certainly also this willingness to explore different and new ways of outreach and how are we finding people where they're at, as we already said. But then finally, there's also a tale to, the cautionary tale that is going to just be about human nature generally, that we always have and are going to continue to still have, which is what are you doing this for? And so for R.C. Evans, at a certain point, if he's doing it for the institution, he lost sight of that. And, or if he's doing it for the calling and mission of Christ and spreading that. And instead he is at a certain point potentially just caught up in his own ego. And that's the kind of thing that happens with human nature all the time. And it's a cautionary thing to always be on the lookout for. And I would say, actually, when you have these kind of skills, like you're the greatest orator of your generation, it's very difficult not to be surrounded by, not to surround yourself with and accept, let's say, only the voices that are praising you and that are constantly giving you the feedback you want to hear, and pushing away all of the critical voices and not wanting to listen to those. And so people get surrounded by what we say, yes men or whatever, and you lose the capacity to discern what's real, right? You start living in a bubble. And that's a tale that was true for Joseph Jr. I think that's the answer of what happened in Nauvoo and why it all went off the rails and everything. And it's also, I think, what happened with R.C. Evans.
We're quick to point it out when it happens in secular world. So we can see the reflection of that right now in the United States in our political dynamic that we're experiencing in early 2021. But we don't like to name it, if you will, in our religious life, in our life of faith together as a community. But the cautionary tale it is. And so it's good for us to remember it and to know it, and to look and reflect on our own lives, for that matter, and what that looks like.
No, I think we shouldn't hesitate to be telling it in our religious life, including when we're talking about prophets or leaders, because we even have that in the literary tales of prophets in the Bible, so even, the Bible's focus on David, and yet David's story is a cautionary tale story. It's told that way. It's not told as a hagiography where every single thing that David ever did was absolutely right, and that. Rather, it's told as a very human story. And it doesn't mean that David as a biblical figure, the literary figure there, is not loved of God because of all the things that David did that are frankly villainous and abuse of authority and all those kind of things. But it shows that God comes to us in and through our humanity, and that our leaders shouldn't be worshipped. Our leaders should be understood to be the people that they are. And that even if you admire someone for all of their capacities, you don't have to admire, buy the entire, everything along with it that goes along with it. In other words, if the person has a blind spot, you're better off helping them identify it if they're able to be reached, so that they don't go off the rails.
Absolutely. So as you are an historian, you have been for your probably whole life in some aspect. So how has your study on historical perspective been affected as you've looked at R.C. Evans? And how is it kind of, what has it said to your own discipleship formation?
Well, I definitely take those cautionary tales to heart. So no matter how much, so my husband, Mike, when I write something that I'm beaming about, and I just think that this is the best essay I've ever written and this kind of a thing, and he immediately sees this spelling error, this grammar error, these kind of things. And so his eye immediately goes to that, and it just deflates me. Nevertheless, I'm very happy to continuously have a partner who is a sounding board, who doesn't just speak to the kind of ego or whatever that I might be feeling when I think I've come up with something that's really, whatever, and who's very supportive of me, but I was also, giving me that grounding and perspective. And I appreciate that in the many close friends I have who do give me those kinds of pushback. And so that definitely, I'm attuned to that, in part because of examples like R.C. Evans. And part of what I did with this particular study, why I did it, is that also, as a historian, but as a historian who is now doing other things in terms of being pastor and other things in church work, I try to encourage people who are interested in history, who are in church, to do their own branch histories, to do their own congregational history. And so part of this grew out of a kind of preliminary study I did of the history of my congregation. And so part of it also is designed to kind of show people, and I know that in this case we have a he's kind of a superstar for the congregation. But there are interesting tales in all local stories. A lot of people aren't aware they haven't heard of R.C. Evans, and they haven't heard that. They might not have heard of any of these things, but you can find interesting stories within your local heritage and explore them, share them. In some cases, there's things that are embarrassing, the things that would have been devastating at the time. So the congregation, was very wounded and there was pain, but it's generations now. So now we can look back at it with retrospect. And so there are stories like that, I think, in your own congregation, wherever you are, that you could explore and share. And I encourage people to do it.
Wonderful encouragement for the historian in all of us. Hopefully we all have an aspect of that to discover. So I want to thank you for sharing a little bit about R.C. Evans with us today. And again, we'll point people to those lectures, and I want them to see all the wonderful slides that you have with the photographs. And you go into more detail about the history of the Toronto congregation. And I just wanted to point out for our listeners who are not from Eastern Canada or the Eastern United States, kind of where Toronto is. I meant to do that at the beginning, and I forgot to do it, and why that would have been one of the first places the church went.
Yes. So we can look out from the lake, and sometimes we can see all the way across the lake to upstate New York, which is where Palmyra and Kirtland is, right? And so we are on Lake Erie, one of the Great Lakes, and Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes. And if we look across Lake Ontario, we can see, anyway, that New York. And so it's very close. And so going over for us to go to a Hill Cumorah trip and things like that is actually very close. People are sometimes a lot of people in the United States aren't too familiar with Canadian geography. And so I get a lot of people who are from California who think that I live in Vancouver, essentially, because they know that Canada is right above them. Actually, Canada is right above everybody. And Toronto is very much closer to, let's say, Washington, D.C. than it is to Independence. Anyway, so.
And just a stone's throw across the border from the original places where the church was formed. So it makes sense that that's where missionaries went. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks. I apologize. I meant to share that at the beginning. So before we end our visit here about R.C. Evans and his life and the schism that took place, any closing thoughts about him that you want to share, or about Toronto, the congregation, or even what you're doing now in Toronto?
Yeah. It's wonderful that we have this kind of this preserved rich heritage. So one of the things that I like about, I think it's true generally across the Restoration, but different congregations have done it better or worse, but just being a record keeping people and also saving heritage. And so I have this repository, of let's say so many archives and books and photos and everything like that, and all the tithing records and all the sacramental records and everything like that, going all the way back to the 1890s for the congregation. And there's no way, even if I devoted myself to it, I could do it justice as a history. But so that's why I just say there's so much that we have in this heritage, and we shouldn't just focus on the beginning part of it. and I think that we should look at like those periods that are otherwise lost. So this particular is a black hole, I think, period of between the Civil War and World War I. And so being able to go back there and see what were our ancestors doing that caused them to want to be part of this. And that helps us when we do that and we understand it, especially more recently than the old past, which is quite alien to us, frankly. So when we get to what was going on in the 50s or the 40s and the 30s and in the end of the last, then we're also able to re-identify what part of our identity, why this has so much meaning to us now. And actually we end up finding, a lot of times people think, the whole Community of Christ trajectory, went nutso beginning in 1960, and it's been on a, Mr. Toad's wild ride or something like that ever since. Actually, the church has been actively changing since it started. And so a lot of people are only aware of the most recent time because that's the end of their actual memory kind of history. But if you open up the archives blow the dust off all this stuff, you realize, wait a second, this has been the entire thing the entire time. And so the more we experience that and the more we understand that, the more, I don't know, we can kind of connect with that like tradition of ongoing excitement and change that has been at the heart of this tradition the whole time.
That's well said, John. Thank you. And thank you for joining us today for this. And I want our listeners to know that you can find John's lecture, as well as the other lectures from the kind of international church or across borders, beyond borders series that the Historic Sites Foundation offered this past autumn. They are all on historicsitesfoundation.org. And I encourage you to view those as well, because you don't want to miss out on the slides and the maps and all of the rest of the content that's there. So for our Cup of Joe, part of the Project Zion podcast, thanks again. I'm Karin Peter. We'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Project Zion Podcast. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcast, Stitcher, or whatever podcast streaming service you use, and while you are there, give us a 5-star rating. Project Zion Podcast is sponsored by Latter-day Seeker Ministries of Community of Christ. The views and opinions expressed in this episode are of those speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Latter-day Seeker Ministries or Community of Christ. The music has been graciously provided by Dave Hines.